In the harsh winters of Pennsylvania's Millbrook Valley, survival often came down to three things: preparation, community, and miracles. The winter of 1887 would test all three for the Coleman family, whose story of perseverance against impossible odds would become legend in those mountain hollows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Coleman, 8 months pregnant and caring for 7 children alone, faced a choice no mother should ever have to make: watch her family starve, or accept help that seemed too good to be true from a mysterious grain merchant whose own past held secrets darker than anyone imagined. What began as an act of desperate charity would evolve into something far more profound, touching the lives of an entire community and proving that sometimes salvation comes disguised as simple business arrangement. This is the story of how one family's darkest hour became the foundation for their greatest triumph, and how a man running from his past found redemption in the most unlikely place. The first snow of November fell like a whispered warning across Millbrook Valley, each flake a reminder that winter had arrived 3 weeks earlier than usual. Margaret Coleman stood at the single window of their cabin on Maple Ridge, her swollen belly pressing against the cold glass as she watched the white blanket settle over their meager vegetable garden. The frost had already claimed what little remained of their late harvest, leaving behind only withered stalks and the bitter knowledge that this winter would be unlike any they had faced before. Behind her, the sounds of her 7 children filled the small 2-room cabin with a symphony of barely contained chaos. Emma, her eldest at 16, worked quietly at the kitchen table, mending a tear in young Daniel's trousers with thread so worn it threatened to snap with each careful stitch. Her weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned adult responsibilities far too young, yet her eyes still held traces of the carefree girl she had been just 18 months ago, before everything changed. Samuel, 14 and trying desperately to fill his father's boots, sat near the fireplace whittling arrows for the makeshift bow he had crafted from hickory. His movements were precise, methodical, each shaving of wood falling into a neat pile. At his feet, the boy had grown 3 inches since spring, his frame stretching upward faster than their meager food supply could support, leaving him all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. Yet he worked with quiet determination, understanding that his success with the bow might mean the difference between a winter of hunger and a winter of starvation. Lucy, 12 years old with braids the color of autumn wheat, helped 8-year-old Anna practice her letters on a slate board that had belonged to their father. The slate was cracked down the middle, held together by careful application of tree sap, but it served its purpose. Lucy's patience with her younger sister was infinite, her voice gentle as she corrected mistakes and offered encouragement. She had inherited her mother's gift for nurturing, though Margaret often worried that the girl was growing up too fast, taking on burdens that should belong to adults. 10-year-old Benjamin sat cross-legged on the floor, entertaining 6-year-old Daniel and 4-year-old Grace with elaborate stories of brave knights and magical kingdoms. His imagination was their greatest treasure, capable of transforming their cramped cabin into castles and their simple meals into royal feasts. The younger children hung on his every word, their eyes bright with wonder even as their bodies showed the telltale signs of insufficient nutrition. Grace, the baby of the family until the new child arrived, curled against Benjamin's side with the complete trust that only the very young possess. Margaret turned away from the window, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where the new life grew stronger each day. 8 months along, and still the child's father would never hold his son or daughter. Thomas Coleman had been gone for over a year now, taken by a cave-in at the Black Rock mine that had claimed 12 good men in a matter of minutes. The mine owners had provided a month's wages as compensation, along with hollow condolences and promises of work for Samuel when he came of age. Those promises and 50 cents would buy a loaf of bread, Margaret had thought bitterly at the time. Now, with winter bearing down upon them, even 50 cents seemed like a fortune. The cabin that had once felt cozy now seemed to shrink a little more each day. Built by Thomas's own hands during their early years of marriage, it had been their sanctuary, their proof that love and hard work could carve out a place of safety in an uncertain world. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that Thomas had bartered labor to obtain. The walls were chinked with mud and moss, the roof covered with hand-split shingles that leaked in only 3 places. By the standards of Millbrook Valley, it was a decent home. By the standards of their current situation, it was a trap waiting to become a tomb. The children had adapted to their reduced circumstances with the resilience that only the young possess. But Margaret saw the signs that worried her most. Emma's dresses hung loose around her waist. Samuel's energy flagged by mid-afternoon. The younger ones played less vigorously. Conserving strength, they didn't realize they were rationing. Most troubling of all, they had stopped complaining about being hungry. In her experience, children who stopped asking for food were children who had learned that asking was futile. Their food stores, carefully rationed since September, would last perhaps another month if they continued eating at starvation levels. The root cellar that Thomas had dug behind the cabin held 3 sacks of turnips, a small barrel of salted pork that would yield maybe 20 meals if stretched thin, and 24 mason jars of preserved vegetables that Emma had managed to save from their garden. It was not enough. Not nearly enough for 7 growing children and a pregnant woman to survive until spring. The sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground outside drew Margaret's attention back to the window. A lone rider was making his way up the narrow path that led to their cabin, his horse picking its way carefully through the accumulated snow. Margaret didn't recognize the man, which was unusual in a valley where everyone knew everyone else's business. Strangers meant either opportunity or trouble, and in their current situation, both possibilities carried equal weight. The rider was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy wool coat that spoke of better circumstances than most valley residents enjoyed. His horse was a fine chestnut Marais, well-fed and properly shod, suggesting that whatever the man's business, it wasn't born of desperation like so many other visits they had received lately. As he drew closer, Margaret could see that he wore his prosperity quietly, without the ostentatious displays that marked the newly wealthy or those trying too hard to impress. Samuel had noticed the approaching visitor as well, setting aside his whittling to move closer to the rifle that hung above the fireplace. At 14, he had developed the cautious instincts of a man protecting his family, though Margaret prayed he would never have to use the skills that necessity was teaching him. The boy's eyes met his mother's, and she shook her head slightly. Not yet. Let them see what the stranger wanted before assuming the worst. The rider dismounted with the easy grace of someone comfortable in the saddle, tying his horse to the post that Thomas had installed for just such purposes. He removed his hat as he approached the cabin, revealing graying hair and a face weathered by years of honest work. Something in his manner suggested education and refinement, yet he moved with the practical awareness of a man who understood the realities of frontier life. His knock on the cabin door was firm but respectful, not the demanding rap of a creditor or the hesitant tap of someone bearing bad news. Margaret smoothed her worn dress and opened the door, noting immediately that the stranger's eyes were kind, holding neither judgment nor pity as they took in her obvious pregnancy and the sounds of children behind her. "Mrs. Coleman," the man said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone educated back east, but tempered by years in Pennsylvania. "My name is Henry Whitfield. I own the grain and feed store down in town. I wonder if I might speak with you for a few minutes." Margaret had heard the name, though she had never done business with the man directly. Whitfield's Grain and Feed had opened its doors only 8 months ago, taking over the space that had housed 3 different failed enterprises in the years since the railroad arrived. The store had quickly developed a reputation for fair dealing and quality goods, though their prices were beyond the reach of families like the Colemans, even in better times. "Mr. Whitfield," Margaret replied, stepping aside to allow him entry. "Please, come in out of the cold. Children, this is Mr. Whitfield from the grain store in town." The children responded with the mixture of curiosity and wariness that their circumstances had taught them. Emma stood respectfully, offering a slight curtsy, while Samuel remained alert near the fireplace. The younger children gathered around. Benjamin, their eyes wide as they studied this unexpected visitor who seemed so different from the hard-faced men who usually came calling with bills or eviction notices. Henry Whitfield removed his coat, revealing a simple but well-made suit that had seen honest wear. His presence seemed to fill the cabin not with arrogance but with a calm authority that spoke of a man comfortable with responsibility. He accepted Margaret's offer of a chair at their small kitchen table, though she noticed he was careful to position himself. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Where he could see all the children, and where they could see him clearly. "Mrs. Coleman," he began, his voice gentle but direct, "I'll speak plainly because I suspect you appreciate honesty more than pretty words. I know about your situation. I know about Thomas's death and the struggles you faced since then. I know that winter is coming and that you're facing impossible choices." Margaret felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. The charity visitors had started arriving 3 weeks ago, well-meaning church ladies with baskets of day-old bread and advice about the virtues of prayer and patience. Each visit had been an exercise in humiliation, accepting handouts that barely made a dent in their needs while listening to suggestions that they break up the family, sending the children to relatives or the county poorhouse until Margaret could get back on her feet. "Mr. Whitfield," she said carefully, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure, "if you've come here to offer charity, I appreciate the thought, but we're managing for now." The grain merchant studied her face for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not disappointment or frustration, but something that looked almost like approval. When he spoke again, his tone carried a different quality, more businesslike, but somehow warmer. "Mrs. Coleman, I haven't come here to offer charity," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I've come here to offer you a job." The words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, taking a moment to penetrate the layers of exhaustion and worry that had become Margaret's constant companions. Around the cabin, the children had gone still, their attention focused entirely on the conversation. At the kitchen table, even Grace had stopped her quiet playing, sensing the importance of the moment without understanding its implications. "A job," Margaret repeated, her mind struggling to process the unexpected turn in the conversation. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Mr. Whitfield, I'm 8 months pregnant with 7 children to care for. What kind of work could I possibly do for you?" Henry Whitfield smiled, and the expression transformed his face completely, revealing warmth and humor that had been hidden beneath his businesslike demeanor. When he spoke, his voice carried conviction that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him, as if he were sharing a truth that had taken him considerable time to discover. "Mrs. Coleman, I have a grain and feed business that's growing faster than I ever expected. I have warehouses that need organizing, inventory that needs tracking, customers that need serving, and books that need keeping. What I don't have is a family to help me manage it all." He paused, glancing around at the children who were listening with rapt attention. "You have organizational skills that I suspect rival any man's, children old enough to learn valuable trades, and the kind of work ethic that builds successful enterprises. It seems to me that we have complementary needs." Emma, who had inherited her mother's quick mind along with her practical nature, stepped forward from her position near the kitchen. Her voice was respectful but direct, showing the kind of maturity that circumstances had forced upon her far too early. "Mr. Whitfield, sir, what exactly would this job involve? Mother can't do heavy lifting in her condition, and we children have limited experience with business matters." The grain merchant turned his attention to Emma with the same respectful seriousness he had shown her mother. Margaret felt a surge of pride at her daughter's poise and intelligence, even as she marveled at how quickly the girl had stepped into the role of family spokesperson. "Miss Emma," Whitfield replied, "that's an excellent question, and I appreciate your directness. The position I have in mind would involve managing the day-to-day operations of my stores, handling correspondence with suppliers, maintaining inventory records, and overseeing customer service. Your mother would be the general manager, with full authority to make decisions about operations and purchasing." He turned back to Margaret, his expression earnest. "The work wouldn't require heavy lifting, but it would require intelligence, attention to detail, and the ability to work with people from all walks of life. From what I've observed about how you've managed your family under difficult circumstances, I believe you possess all of those qualities." Samuel, who had been listening intently while maintaining his protective stance near the fireplace, cleared his throat respectfully. "Mr. Whitfield, sir, what about us children? We can work, but we're not experienced in business matters." "Another excellent question," Whitfield replied, and Margaret noticed that he seemed genuinely pleased by her children's thoughtfulness. "Samuel, I understand you have some skill with woodworking and mechanical tasks. My business involves a great deal of equipment maintenance and repair work. Emma, your skills with organization and numbers would be invaluable in managing inventory and customer accounts." He looked around at the younger children, his expression kind but serious. "Lucy, Anna, Benjamin, Daniel, and Grace, you would all learn various aspects of the business as your ages and abilities allow. There's always work to be done in a grain and feed operation, from organizing stock to helping customers to maintaining the facilities. Everyone would contribute according to their capabilities." Margaret found herself leaning forward, her mind racing as she tried to understand the full implications of what Whitfield was proposing. The offer seemed too good to be true, too perfect an answer to prayers she had barely dared to voice. In her experience, solutions that appeared miraculous usually carried hidden costs that revealed themselves only after it was too late to withdraw. "Mr. Whitfield," she said slowly, "this is very generous, but I have to ask what you gain from such an arrangement. Surely you could hire experienced workers for less trouble than taking on a pregnant woman and 7 children." The grain merchant was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if he were seeing something beyond the walls of the small cabin. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of emotion that suggested personal history behind his words. "Mrs. Coleman, I've been in business for 32 years, starting with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than the next man. I've learned that success isn't just about profits and efficiency. It's about building something that matters, something that creates value for everyone involved." He paused, his gaze returning to meet hers directly. "I need people I can trust. People who understand what it means to work for something important. Your family has already proven that you possess those qualities." The conviction in his voice was compelling, but Margaret had learned to be cautious about trusting her first impressions, especially when her children's welfare was at stake. The offer addressed all their immediate needs and more, but accepting it would mean placing their entire future in the hands of a man they had met less than an hour ago. "What would be the specific terms of employment?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Where would we live? What would be our responsibilities? And compensation?" Whitfield reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document that appeared to be a formal contract. "I've taken the liberty of drafting a preliminary agreement," he said, placing the papers on the table between them. "The position would include housing in the apartment above the main store, full management authority over daily operations, and Compensation that I believe you'll find fair. Margaret accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly, whether from emotion or exhaustion she couldn't say. The contract was written in clear, straightforward language that spoke of honest dealing and mutual respect. The compensation package included not just wages but also housing, food allowances, and provisions for the children's education and training. Emma moved to stand behind her mother's chair, reading over her shoulder with the quick comprehension that had always characterized her approach to written materials. Margaret could see the girl's eyes widening as she processed the details of Whitfield's offer, and she knew that Emma was recognizing the same thing that was slowly dawning on her. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a complete transformation of their circumstances. "Mr. Whitfield," Margaret said, looking up from the contract, "this is far more generous than I expected. The compensation alone would solve our immediate problems, and the opportunity for the children to learn valuable skills." She trailed off, shaking her head in amazement. "There's something else," Whitfield said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The grain business in this valley is growing rapidly, but it's also attracting attention from larger companies that want to control the market. Having a strong local operation with deep community ties will be essential for surviving the changes that are coming. Your family's reputation in this valley, your connections to the farming and mining communities, would be invaluable assets." The mention of outside companies seeking to control local markets struck a chord of recognition in Margaret's memory. Thomas had often spoken about similar pressures in the mining industry, how distant corporations gradually squeezed out local operations through a combination of economic pressure and political influence. The pattern was becoming familiar across Pennsylvania as industrialization transformed traditional ways of life. Samuel, who had been following the conversation with intense concentration, stepped forward with the careful respect he had learned to show adult authority figures. "Mr. Whitfield, sir, would this arrangement be permanent, or would it be temporary until Mother could find other work?" The grain merchant smiled at the boy's directness. "Samuel, if your family proves as capable as I expect, this could be a permanent partnership. In fact, I'm hoping that over time, your mother might become not just an employee, but a partner in the business. Success builds on success, and I believe we could create something significant together." The word partner resonated in the small cabin like a bell tolling hope where there had been only despair. Margaret felt something stirring in her chest that she had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of a future that held more than mere survival. For over a year, her life had been reduced to a series of increasingly difficult choices about which necessities they could do without. The concept of building something positive seemed almost foreign after so many months of managed decline. Lucy, who had been listening with the intense focus that characterized her approach to everything important, raised her hand slightly in the gesture she used in school when seeking permission to speak. "Mr. Whitfield, sir, would we still be able to attend school and church? Mother says education is important for all of us." "Another wise question, Miss Lucy," Whitfield replied. "Education would not just be permitted but encouraged. The apartment above the store is within walking distance of both the schoolhouse and St. Mary's Church. Additionally, working in the grain business would provide practical education in mathematics, science, and business principles that would complement your formal schooling." Margaret found herself studying Whitfield's face as he interacted with her children, looking for signs of impatience or condescension that would reveal his true character. Instead, she saw genuine interest in their questions and respect for their intelligence. The man seemed to understand that winning over the children was as important as convincing her, and his approach suggested someone accustomed to thinking in terms of families rather than individuals. "Mr. Whitfield," she said finally, "your offer is incredibly generous, more than generous. But I have to ask why you're willing to take such a risk on us. Surely there are other candidates with more relevant experience." The grain merchant leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming thoughtful. "Mrs. Coleman, I've learned that experience can be taught, but character cannot. I've watched how this community has responded to your family's difficulties, and I've seen how you've maintained your dignity and your children's welfare, despite circumstances that would break many people. That tells me more about your qualifications than any resume could." He stood up from the table, moving to the window where Margaret had been watching the snow fall earlier. "There's something else," he said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I opened my store in Millbrook Valley because I believe in the potential of this community. But business success requires more than just good products and fair prices. It requires trust, and trust grows from relationships built on mutual respect and shared values." The grain merchant turned back to face the family, his expression serious but kind. "Your family represents everything that's best about this valley. Hard work, loyalty, resilience, and commitment to one another. Having you as part of my operation wouldn't just solve your immediate problems and mine. It would send a message to the entire community about what kind of business I'm trying to build." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes, though whether they were tears of relief, gratitude, or overwhelming emotion she couldn't say. After months of feeling invisible, of being seen only as an object of pity or a burden to be managed, Whitfield's words painted her family as assets rather than liabilities. The shift in perspective was so profound that it took her several moments to fully process its implications. Emma, ever practical, had been studying the contract with the thoroughness that characterized her approach to important decisions. "Mother," she said softly, "the terms are fair, more than fair, and the opportunities for all of us to learn and grow." She looked up with eyes that held hope for the first time in months. "I think we should consider this very seriously." The other children had gathered closer during the conversation, drawn by the sense that something momentous was being decided. Even Grace, at 4 years old, seemed to understand that the man with the kind voice was offering them something important. Her small hand slipped into Margaret's, offering the wordless support that had sustained them all through the darkest months. "I need to think about this," Margaret said finally, her voice heavy with the weight of decision. "It's not just my future at stake, but theirs as well. I need to be certain that I'm making the right choice for all of us." Whitfield nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Coleman, the fact that you want to consider this carefully only confirms my belief that you're the right person for this position. I wouldn't trust someone who made such an important decision impulsively." He moved toward his coat, preparing to leave. "Take whatever time you need. The offer will remain open." As the grain merchant prepared to depart, Samuel stepped forward with the protective instinct that had become second nature to him. "Mr. Whitfield, sir, might I ask how you learned about our situation? We haven't advertised our difficulties." Whitfield paused in putting on his coat, his expression becoming thoughtful. "That's a fair question, Samuel. In a community this size, word travels quickly about families facing hardship. Pastor Mills mentioned your situation when he was encouraging local businessmen to consider how we might help. Sheriff Carter has spoken about your family's reputation for honesty and hard work. Dr. Hayes has commented on your mother's character and intelligence." The mention of these familiar names provided context that helped Margaret understand how Whitfield had come to know about their circumstances. Pastor Mills had been their family's spiritual advisor since their arrival in the valley, and Sheriff Carter had been a friend of Thomas's. Dr. Hayes had attended the births of their 3 youngest children and had refused payment for his services during Thomas's final illness. "The thing is," Whitfield continued, "everyone who mentioned your family spoke about you with respect and admiration. That's rare, Mrs. Coleman. Most people in difficulty become objects of pity or judgment. Your family seems to have earned something much more valuable, genuine regard from your neighbors." Margaret felt a flush of pride at these words, mixed with gratitude toward the community members who had spoken well of her family despite their current struggles. The knowledge that their difficulties hadn't diminished their standing in the Eyes of people they respected provided comfort that she hadn't realized she needed. After Whitfield departed, the cabin fell into an unusual quiet as each family member contemplated the implications of what they had just heard. The grain merchant's offer represented more than just employment. It offered a path toward rebuilding their lives with dignity and purpose. Yet Margaret knew that accepting would mean stepping into unknown territory, trusting their future to a man they had met for the first time that afternoon. Emma broke the silence first, her voice thoughtful, but optimistic. "Mother, I've been thinking about what Mr. Whitfield said about partnership. If he's genuine about that possibility, this could be more than just a job. It could be a chance to build something lasting for our family." Samuel nodded in agreement, though his expression remained cautious. "The work sounds honest, and the compensation would solve our immediate problems. But I keep wondering why someone would make such a generous offer to strangers." These were the same questions that had been circling through Margaret's mind since Whitfield's departure. The offer seemed almost too perfect, addressing not just their urgent need for income and shelter, but also providing opportunities for the children's development and education. In her experience, solutions that appeared flawless often concealed complications that became apparent only after commitment was made. Yet as she studied her children's faces in the flickering firelight, Margaret realized that her alternatives were severely limited. Winter was closing in rapidly, their food supplies were dwindling, and the baby would arrive within a month. The choice wasn't really between Whitfield's offer and other opportunities. It was between accepting help and facing almost certain disaster. The sound of wind picking up outside reminded them all that November was advancing toward December, and with it the harsh realities of Pennsylvania mountain winters. The cabin that had provided adequate shelter during milder weather would become increasingly difficult to heat as temperatures dropped. Their meager food stores, already insufficient, would need to be stretched even thinner if they tried to survive on their own until spring. Margaret made her decision with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every crisis since Thomas's death. Standing up from her chair at the kitchen table, she looked around at her 7 children with eyes that held both love and resolve. "We're going to accept Mr. Whitfield's offer," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Not because we're desperate, though we are, but because it's the right opportunity for our family. We're going to work harder than he expects, contribute more than he hopes for, and prove that his faith in us was well placed." The cabin erupted in a mixture of excitement and nervous energy as the children processed their mother's decision. Emma stepped forward to embrace Margaret, her eyes bright with tears of relief. Samuel nodded approvingly, his young face showing the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing a difficult problem solved through courage and wisdom. The younger children gathered around their mother, their questions tumbling over each other, in their eagerness to understand what this change would mean for their daily lives. Margaret answered each inquiry with patience and optimism, painting pictures of their new life that emphasized opportunity and adventure rather than mere escape from hardship. As evening settled over Millbrook Valley and the Coleman family prepared for what would be their last night in the cabin that had been their home for 8 years, Margaret felt something she had almost forgotten: hope for a future that held more than survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but also new possibilities that seemed as vast as the snow-covered mountains surrounding their valley. The widow's winter was ending before it had truly begun, replaced by the promise of spring and the chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of their former life. The Coleman family's first week at Whitfield's grain and feed store passed in a blur of learning and adjustment that left Margaret both exhilarated and exhausted. The apartment above the main store proved to be far more spacious than their cabin had been, with 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen with running water, and windows that faced both Main Street and the rolling hills beyond town. For the first time in over a year, Margaret found herself making decisions based on opportunity rather than desperation. Henry Whitfield had proven to be exactly what his initial visit had suggested: a fair employer with an eye for practical solutions and a genuine respect for hard work. He spent the first 3 days walking Margaret through every aspect of the business, from the intricacies of grain pricing and seasonal demand fluctuations to the delicate art of managing relationships with both suppliers and customers. His teaching method was patient but thorough, never talking down to her, but ensuring she understood not just the procedures but the reasoning behind them. Emma had taken to the inventory management system with an aptitude that surprised even Margaret. The girl possessed an intuitive understanding of organization and record-keeping that transformed what could have been tedious work into a precise science. Within days, she had reorganized the entire filing system and discovered several discrepancies in previous records that had cost the store money through duplicate orders and missed deliveries. Samuel found himself working alongside Jake Morrison, Whitfield's head warehouse supervisor, learning the physical aspects of the grain business. The work was demanding but honest, requiring both strength and intelligence, as different types of grain required specific handling and storage methods. The boy threw himself into the labor with enthusiasm, grateful to be contributing meaningfully to his family's welfare, while learning skills that would serve him throughout his life. The younger children adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that had carried them through their months of hardship. Lucy helped with customer service, her natural warmth and quick mind making her popular with the farming families, who constituted much of the store's clientele. Anna and Benjamin assisted with smaller organizational tasks, while Daniel and Grace simply reveled in the security of regular meals and a warm place to sleep. Margaret had been managing the store's operations for exactly 1 week when Pastor Jonathan Mills arrived with news that would test their newfound stability. The elderly clergyman appeared at the store's front entrance just before closing time, his usual serene expression replaced by obvious concern. Margaret invited him into the private office behind the main counter, noting immediately that his visit was not a social call. "Margaret," Pastor Mills began without his customary pleasantries, "I've received some troubling information that I felt you should know about immediately. It concerns your landlord's situation at the cabin." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Even though they had moved out of the cabin, she had assumed their departure would simplify rather than complicate their relationship with Marcus Thornton, the man who had inherited the property along with several others. When his uncle died the previous spring, Thornton had been pressuring her to pay back rent that had accumulated during their worst months, threatening eviction even after learning about their plans to relocate. "What kind of trouble, Pastor?" Margaret asked, settling into the chair behind Whitfield's massive oak desk. The furniture still felt foreign to her, symbols of authority and responsibility that she was still learning to inhabit comfortably. Pastor Mills removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through his thinning hair, a gesture she recognized as his way of preparing to deliver difficult news. "Thornton has filed a legal claim against you for property damages and unpaid rent. He's alleging that your family caused deliberate harm to the cabin and owes him not just the back rent, but additional compensation for repairs." The accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow. During their years in the cabin, Thomas had maintained the property meticulously, taking pride in keeping their home in better condition than when they had first rented it. Even during their most difficult months, she had ensured that any necessary repairs were made promptly, often at the expense of other necessities. "That's impossible," Margaret said, her voice rising with indignation. "Thomas improved that cabin every year we lived there. We left it in better condition than we found it. What specific damages is he claiming?" Pastor Mills consulted a folded paper he had withdrawn from his coat pocket, his expression growing more troubled as he read. "According to the legal documents, he's claiming damage to the roof, floors, and walls. He says the property requires extensive repairs before it can be rented to another family. The total he's seeking is $340. $340. The amount was staggering, representing more than 2 years of their previous income and nearly half of what Margaret expected to earn in her first year with Whitfield. Even with their improved circumstances, such a sum would devastate their family's financial recovery and potentially force them back into the poverty they had just escaped. Margaret stood up from the desk and began pacing the small office, her mind racing through the implications of Thornton's claim. The man had visited the cabin only once during their tenancy, arriving unannounced 3 months after Thomas's death, with demands for immediate rent payment. She remembered his cursory inspection of the property, his obvious discomfort with the presence of so many children, and his barely concealed eagerness to find reasons to terminate their lease. "Pastor, you've been to our cabin many times over the years. You know the condition we maintained it in. This claim is completely false, but how do we prove that against the word of a property owner?" The elderly minister nodded gravely, his expression reflecting both sympathy and concern. "Margaret, I've already spoken with Sheriff Carter about the situation. He remembers the condition of the cabin from his visits, and he's prepared to testify on your behalf if necessary. Dr. Hayes has similar recollections, as does Clara Henderson." The mention of these witnesses provided some comfort, but Margaret understood enough about legal proceedings to know that character testimony, while valuable, might not be sufficient to counter Thornton's claims, especially if he had documentation or other evidence to support his accusations. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Henry Whitfield entered quietly, his expression immediately shifting to concern as he noted the serious nature of the discussion taking place in his private space. "I apologize for interrupting," he said, "but I noticed Pastor Mills arriving and wanted to ensure everything was well with the family. If this is a private matter, I can certainly leave you to your conversation." Margaret found herself caught between her natural inclination toward privacy and her growing recognition that Whitfield's support might be crucial in dealing with this new crisis. Pastor Mills, reading her hesitation accurately, spoke up before she could respond. "Henry, this concerns a legal matter that could significantly impact Margaret's ability to fulfill her responsibilities here. I think it would be appropriate for you to hear the details." Whitfield settled into the remaining chair without further invitation, his attention focused entirely on Pastor Mills as the minister explained Thornton's claims and their potential consequences. Margaret watched her employer's face carefully, looking for signs of concern about how this legal trouble might affect their business arrangement. Instead of worry or disappointment, she saw something that looked remarkably like anger. When Pastor Mills finished his explanation, Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with controlled emotion. "Marcus Thornton," he said finally, his voice carrying a hard edge that Margaret had never heard before. "I should have expected something like this. The man has been systematically pressuring every family in difficult circumstances, using legal intimidation to extract money they don't owe." This revelation added a new dimension to Margaret's understanding of her situation. Rather than being the victim of an isolated incident of greed, she was apparently part of a pattern of exploitation that targeted the valley's most vulnerable residents. "You've encountered this before?" she asked, surprised by the personal animosity in Whitfield's voice. The grain merchant nodded grimly. 3 times in the past 6 months. Families who fell behind on rent due to illness or job loss, suddenly facing exaggerated claims for property damages after they moved out or were evicted. In each case, Thornton waited until the families found new employment or circumstances, then struck with legal demands designed to extract maximum payment. Pastor Mills leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing more serious. "Henry, are you suggesting that this is a deliberate strategy rather than legitimate property management?" "I'm suggesting that Marcus Thornton has discovered a profitable way to exploit people's desperation and their fear of legal consequences," Whitfield replied. He targets families when they're most vulnerable, makes inflated claims that are difficult to dispute, and counts on their inability to afford proper legal representation. The picture that emerged from this conversation was deeply disturbing. Margaret realized that accepting Whitfield's job offer had probably made her a more attractive target for Thornton's scheme, as her improved circumstances made it more likely that she could be pressured into paying an unjust settlement rather than risk losing her new position. "What happened to the other families?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Two of them paid settlements they couldn't afford," Whitfield said quietly. "The third family left the valley entirely rather than face the legal proceedings. In every case, Thornton got what he wanted: money from people who had done nothing wrong." The injustice of the situation sparked an anger in Margaret that surprised her with its intensity. After months of accepting charity with humble gratitude, she found herself unwilling to be victimized by someone who preyed on families struggling to rebuild their lives. "Then we fight it," she said, her voice carrying a determination that seemed to fill the small office. "I won't pay money I don't owe for damages that don't exist, and I won't let this man intimidate our family into submission." Pastor Mills and Whitfield exchanged glances that suggested they had hoped for exactly this response, but weren't entirely surprised by her resolve. Margaret realized that both men had probably been testing her character as much as informing her about the legal threat. "Fighting will require legal representation," Pastor Mills observed. "That means expenses that could exceed the settlement Thornton is seeking, with no guarantee of victory." Margaret had been thinking about exactly this problem since learning about the lawsuit. Legal representation was expensive, and even winning the case might cost more than losing it. Yet something in her rebelled against the idea of paying money to a man who was deliberately exploiting her family's previous vulnerability. "There might be another option," Whitfield said slowly, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when considering complex business decisions. "I've been dealing with similar issues in my business relationships, situations where larger companies try to use legal intimidation to force unfair terms on smaller operations." He stood up from his chair and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office, withdrawing a thick folder that appeared to contain legal documents and correspondence. "I've been working with a lawyer in Pittsburgh who specializes in these kinds of predatory practices. He might be interested in taking your case, especially if it's part of a larger pattern of exploitation." The possibility of professional legal help without crushing expense opened new possibilities for fighting Thornton's claims. Margaret felt a surge of hope mixed with gratitude toward Whitfield, whose support was going far beyond what any employer might reasonably provide. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I can't ask you to involve yourself in my legal troubles. You've already done more for our family than we could ever repay." The grain merchant looked at her with an expression that combined respect and something that might have been affection. "Margaret, you're not asking me to do anything. I'm choosing to help because it's the right thing to do, and because allowing Thornton to continue this pattern of exploitation hurts the entire community." Pastor Mills nodded approvingly at this response. "Henry makes an excellent point. When men like Thornton are allowed to prey on vulnerable families, it creates fear that prevents people from taking the risks necessary to improve their circumstances. Your case could help protect other families from similar exploitation." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's voice calling from the main store area. Margaret excused herself to address whatever issue had arisen, leaving the office to find her daughter dealing with a customer complaint about a grain delivery that had apparently arrived with quality problems. The farmer, a weathered man named Peterson, whom Margaret recognized from church, was clearly frustrated, but trying to remain respectful as he explained the situation. His latest shipment of feed grain contained an unusually high percentage of damaged kernels, making it unsuitable for his livestock without significant waste. Margaret listened carefully to Peterson's description of the problem, then consulted the delivery records that Emma had organized so efficiently. The shipment had come from a new supplier that Whitfield had been testing, and Peterson's complaint suggested that the quality control measures hadn't been adequate. "Mr. Peterson," Margaret said after reviewing the documentation, "I apologize for the problem with your delivery. We'll replace the entire shipment at no charge, and will cover the cost of transporting the defective grain back to our supplier." The farmer's expression shifted from frustration to surprise. Most businesses in his experience would have required extensive documentation and proof before agreeing to such a comprehensive remedy. Margaret's immediate acceptance of responsibility and commitment to making things right represented the kind of customer service that built lasting loyalty. "Mrs. Coleman, I appreciate your willingness to address the problem, but that's a significant expense for your store to absorb. Are you certain that's the appropriate response?" Margaret smiled, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate the values that Whitfield had emphasized during her training. "Mr. Peterson, our business depends on the trust of customers like you. The cost of replacing defective merchandise is much less than the cost of losing that trust. We'll make this right, and we'll ensure it doesn't happen again." After Peterson departed with assurances that his replacement grain would be delivered within 2 days, Margaret returned to the office to find Whitfield concluding his conversation with Pastor Mills. Both men looked pleased, though their expressions suggested they had been discussing matters beyond the immediate legal situation. "Margaret," Whitfield said as she rejoined them, "I've just finished explaining to Pastor Mills why I believe your legal troubles might actually represent an opportunity, rather than just a problem." This unexpected perspective caught Margaret's attention immediately. After spending the past hour contemplating the potentially devastating consequences of Thornton's lawsuit, she found it difficult to imagine how legal action against her family could represent anything positive. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, settling back into her chair behind the desk. Whitfield leaned forward, his expression taking on the animated quality it acquired whenever he was developing a complex business strategy. "Thornton's pattern of exploitation has been successful because his victims have been isolated, dealing with his threats individually. But if we can demonstrate that his behavior represents a deliberate pattern of fraud, we might be able to turn the tables on him." Pastor Mills nodded enthusiastically. "Henry believes that by fighting your case vigorously and publicly, we might encourage other families to come forward with their own experiences. That could transform individual harassment into a larger case of systematic fraud." The possibility was intriguing, but also intimidating. Margaret understood that serving as the focal point for such a case would require courage and persistence. That went far beyond protecting her own family's interests. She would be taking on the role of community champion, fighting not just for herself, but for every family that Thornton had victimized or might victimize in the future. "What would that involve?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral as she considered the implications. "It would mean accepting more risk and more public attention than simply defending against his claims," Whitfield replied honestly. "But it would also mean turning his strategy against him. Instead of being the victim of his intimidation, you would become the leader of a community response to his predatory behavior." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple voices in the main store area, suggesting that several customers had arrived simultaneously. Margaret excused herself to address the situation, leaving Whitfield and Pastor Mills to continue their strategic discussions. In the main store, she found Emma and Lucy working together to serve 3 different farming families who had arrived within minutes of each other, each needing different products and services. The girls were handling the rush with impressive competence, but Margaret could see that they were approaching the limits of their experience with complex customer needs. She stepped in to assist with the most complicated transaction, helping the Hendersons calculate the precise mixture of grains needed for their dairy operations feeding program. The work required both mathematical precision and practical knowledge of livestock nutrition, skills she had been developing rapidly during her weeks of training. As she worked through the calculations with the Henderson family, Margaret found herself thinking about the conversation in Whitfield's office. The grain merchant's suggestion that her legal troubles might represent an opportunity resonated with something fundamental in her character. Throughout her life, she had instinctively chosen to confront problems directly rather than avoid them, and the idea of fighting back against Thornton's exploitation appealed to her sense of justice. The decision crystallized as she completed the Hendersons' order and watched their satisfaction with the service they had received. These were good people who worked hard and treated others fairly, exactly the kind of families that Thornton was targeting with his predatory schemes. They deserved protection from exploitation, and she was in a position to provide it. When the last customers departed and the store closed for the evening, Margaret returned to the office where Whitfield and Pastor Mills were finalizing their plans for addressing her legal situation. Both men looked up expectantly as she entered, clearly hoping that her time with customers had helped clarify her thinking about their proposal. "I've made my decision," Margaret said, settling into her chair with the kind of deliberate calm that her children had learned to recognize as a sign of maternal resolve. "We're going to fight Thornton's claims, and we're going to do everything possible to protect other families from his predatory behavior." Whitfield smiled with genuine pleasure at her response. "Margaret, I was hoping you would reach that conclusion. The lawyer I mentioned in Pittsburgh has agreed to take your case on a contingency basis, meaning you won't pay legal fees unless we win. He's particularly interested in the broader implications of Thornton's behavior." Pastor Mills reached across the desk to squeeze Margaret's hand, his expression reflecting both pride and concern. "My dear, you understand that this decision will bring scrutiny and pressure that could be difficult for your family. Are you prepared for that level of attention?" Margaret thought about her children, who had demonstrated such remarkable resilience during their months of hardship. Emma's growing confidence in managing business responsibilities, Samuel's pride in contributing to their family's welfare, the younger children's joy in their improved circumstances. They had all proven capable of handling challenges that would overwhelm many adults. "Pastor, our family has been through worse than legal proceedings and public attention. What we haven't been through is having the opportunity to stand up for what's right when we had the resources and support to do it effectively. This feels like exactly the kind of fight we should be willing to take on." The evening ended with concrete plans for moving forward. Whitfield would contact his Pittsburgh lawyer within the next 2 days. Pastor Mills would begin quietly gathering information about other families who might have been victimized by Thornton's schemes. And Margaret would document everything she could remember about their tenancy and the condition of the cabin when they departed. As Margaret climbed the stairs to the apartment above the store, she found her children gathered in the main room, obviously aware that important discussions had been taking place, but respectful enough not to eavesdrop. Emma looked up from the mending she was doing by lamplight, her expression questioning but patient. "Mother," Emma said carefully, "we couldn't help but notice that Pastor Mills seemed concerned about something. Is there trouble that affects our situation here?" Margaret settled into the comfortable chair that Whitfield had provided for the apartment's sitting area, gathering her thoughts before responding. Her children deserved to understand what was happening and why she had chosen to fight rather than seek a quiet settlement. "Children," she began, using the tone that signaled family discussion rather than simple information sharing, "we're facing a legal challenge from Mr. Thornton about our old cabin. He's making claims about property damage that aren't true, and he's demanding money that we don't owe." Samuel looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression immediately shifting to the protective alertness that had become habitual during their difficult months. "What kind of claims, Mother? And what does this mean for our position here?" Margaret explained Thornton's accusations and the broader pattern of exploitation that Whitfield had identified. She watched her children's faces as they processed the information, noting their progression from surprise to anger to determination. These children had learned hard lessons about justice and injustice during their months of poverty, and their responses reflected both maturity and moral clarity. "So we fight," Lucy said simply, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that Margaret had heard in her own words earlier. "We don't let him hurt other families the way he's trying to hurt us." Emma nodded approvingly at her sister's response. "Mother, do we have sufficient evidence to prove that his claims are false? And what will fighting mean for our family's future?" The questions were exactly the ones Margaret had been asking herself throughout the evening. The legal battle would consume time, energy, and emotional resources that could otherwise be devoted to building their new life. Yet allowing Thornton's exploitation to continue unchallenged seemed like a betrayal of the values that had sustained them through their darkest period. "We have witnesses who can testify to the condition of the cabin," Margaret replied. "Pastor Mills, Sheriff Carter, Dr. Hayes, and Clara Henderson have all seen the property and can speak to how well we maintained it. More importantly, we have the support of people like Mr. Whitfield who understand that this fight is about more than just our family." The conversation continued for another hour as Margaret outlined the plans that had been developed during her meeting with Whitfield and Pastor Mills. Each child contributed questions and observations that demonstrated their understanding of both the risks and the potential benefits of fighting Thornton's claims. As the evening drew to a close and the children prepared for bed, Margaret found herself reflecting on how much their circumstances had changed since Whitfield's unexpected visit to their cabin. The grain merchant's offer had provided more than employment and housing. It had given them the stability and support necessary to fight injustice rather than simply endure it. The legal battle ahead would test their resilience in new ways, but Margaret felt confident that her family was prepared for whatever challenges might arise. They had survived poverty and desperation. They could certainly handle the complexities of defending themselves against false accusations. More importantly, they had found something worth fighting for, not just their own welfare, but the principle that families facing hardship deserved protection rather than exploitation. The widow's winter was truly over, replaced by the promise of spring and the opportunity to ensure that other families would not face the same predatory behavior that threatened to destroy everything they had rebuilt. The Pittsburgh lawyer arrived in Millbrook Valley on a gray December morning that matched his serious demeanor perfectly. Franklin Walsh stepped off the eastbound train with the measured precision of a man who had spent 30 years navigating legal battlefields, his leather briefcase worn smooth from constant use and his sharp eyes already cataloging details about the small mountain community that would serve as the backdrop for his latest case. Margaret met him at the station along with Henry Whitfield, both of them curious to measure the man who would determine whether their fight against Marcus Thornton would succeed or collapse under the weight of small-town politics and legal maneuvering. Walsh stood perhaps 5 feet 8 inches tall, his graying hair meticulously groomed, and his dark suit impeccably tailored despite the rigors of train travel. Everything about his appearance suggested competence and attention to detail, qualities that Margaret hoped would translate into courtroom effectiveness. The lawyer's handshake was firm without being aggressive, his greeting polite but businesslike as he acknowledged both Margaret and Whitfield with the professional courtesy of someone who understood that first impressions often determined the success or failure of attorney-client relationships. His voice carried the cultured accents of Eastern education, tempered by years of practical experience with rural Pennsylvania legal proceedings. "Mrs. Coleman," Walsh said as they walked toward Whitfield's waiting carriage, "I've reviewed the preliminary documents that Mr. Whitfield forwarded to my office, and I must tell you that your case presents both significant opportunities and considerable challenges. Before we proceed, I need to ensure that you understand exactly what we're undertaking." Margaret appreciated his directness, having grown weary of well-meaning advisors who softened harsh realities with false optimism. The months of poverty had taught her to value honesty over comfort, and Walsh's willingness to acknowledge difficulties rather than minimize them suggested the kind of realistic approach that her situation required. "Mr. Walsh," she replied as they settled into the carriage for the ride to Whitfield's store, "I understand that fighting Mr. Thornton's claims involves risks that go beyond simple legal expenses. What I need to know is whether you believe we have genuine prospects for success, not just the possibility of making our point publicly." The lawyer studied her face carefully before responding, his expression revealing neither optimism nor pessimism, but rather the analytical neutrality of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence without emotional investment. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of professional experience rather than personal opinion. "Mrs. Coleman, based on the information Mr. Whitfield has provided and my preliminary research into Mr. Thornton's activities, I believe we have excellent prospects for defeating his specific claims against you. The evidence supporting your proper maintenance of the rental property appears solid, and we have credible witnesses who can testify to the cabin's condition during your tenancy." He paused as their carriage navigated around a freight wagon loaded with winter supplies, his attention briefly diverted by the bustling activity of Millbrook Valley's Main Street. Margaret noticed that he seemed to be cataloging everything he observed, filing away details about the community that might prove relevant to their legal strategy. "However," Walsh continued, "if we're going to pursue the broader case against Mr. Thornton's pattern of exploitation, we'll need testimony from other families who have been similarly victimized. That means convincing people to come forward publicly with their experiences, which often proves difficult when families fear retaliation or additional legal action." The challenge he identified was exactly what Margaret had expected, but hearing it articulated by someone with extensive legal experience made the obstacle seem more daunting. Families who had already suffered from Thornton's predatory behavior would naturally be reluctant to expose themselves to additional scrutiny and potential consequences. Whitfield, who had been listening quietly to their conversation, leaned forward with the kind of determined expression that Margaret had learned to associate with his most ambitious business strategies. "Mr. Walsh, I've been thinking about that particular problem, and I believe I may have identified a solution that addresses families' concerns while still providing the testimony we need." The lawyer turned his attention to the grain merchant with obvious interest, his professional experience having taught him to listen carefully to local insights that might not be apparent to outside observers. "What kind of solution did you have in mind, Mr. Whitfield? What if we could demonstrate Mr. Thornton's pattern of behavior without requiring individual families to expose themselves publicly? I've been maintaining informal records of his activities for months, documenting cases where families have confided in me about his tactics. Combined with Pastor Mill's knowledge and Sheriff Carter's observations, we might be able to establish the pattern without forcing vulnerable people into courtroom testimony." Walsh considered this suggestion with the thoroughness that characterized his approach to legal strategy, his mind clearly working through potential applications and complications. Margaret found herself impressed by both men's willingness to think creatively about protecting other families while still building a strong case against Thornton's exploitation. "That approach has merit," the lawyer said finally, "but we would still need at least some direct testimony from affected families to establish the credibility of the broader pattern. However, we might be able to limit that testimony to families who are in stronger positions to withstand potential retaliation." The carriage arrived at Whitfield's store just as this conversation reached its natural conclusion, providing Margaret with an opportunity to process what she had learned about the legal strategy while showing Walsh through the business that had become central to her family's recovery. The lawyer's interest in examining both the store's operations and the apartment above suggested that he understood the importance of demonstrating her family's stability and community integration. Emma greeted them at the store's entrance with the poised professionalism that had become second nature to her during their weeks of working in the grain business. Margaret watched Walsh's expression as her daughter provided a concise overview of the inventory system and customer service procedures, noting his obvious approval of Emma's competence and maturity. "Mrs. Coleman," Walsh observed as they moved through the store, "your daughter's business acumen is remarkable for someone her age. That kind of practical intelligence will serve your family well, regardless of how our legal proceedings develop." The compliment pleased Margaret, not just because it recognized Emma's capabilities, but because it suggested that Walsh saw her family as assets rather than liabilities in their upcoming legal battle. Too many professional advisors had focused on their previous difficulties rather than their demonstrated resilience and adaptability. Samuel appeared from the warehouse area where he had been working with Jake Morrison on a delivery preparation, his clothes dusty from handling grain sacks, but his bearing reflecting the quiet confidence that physical labor had restored to him. The boy acknowledged Walsh respectfully before returning to his work, understanding instinctively that the lawyer's visit represented important family business that required adult attention. In the private office behind the store's main counter, Walsh spread out the documents he had brought from Pittsburgh alongside the materials that Whitfield and Margaret had assembled during their weeks of preparation. The resulting collection painted a comprehensive picture of both Margaret's specific situation and the broader pattern of Thornton's predatory behavior throughout Millbrook Valley. "Before we proceed with detailed strategy discussions," Walsh said, settling into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for extended analytical work, "I need to understand exactly what Mr. Thornton has been doing and why he believes his tactics will continue to be successful." Margaret and Whitfield spent the next hour providing detailed background on Thornton's inheritance of multiple properties, his systematic approach to identifying vulnerable tenants, and his method of waiting until family showed signs of recovery before striking with inflated damage claims. The lawyer listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to extracting legal significance from complex factual situations. "What you're describing," Walsh said when they finished their explanation, "constitutes a sophisticated form of fraud that depends on his victim's inability to mount effective legal responses. His success has probably made him overconfident about his methods, which creates opportunities for us to turn his own tactics against him." The phrase "turn his tactics against him" resonated with Margaret in ways that reminded her of her late husband's approach to solving mechanical problems at the mine. Thomas had often said that the best way to defeat a complex system was to understand it thoroughly enough to use its own mechanisms against it. What exactly would that involve? She asked, leaning forward with the kind of focused attention that important decisions required. Walsh opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing what appeared to be legal documents from previous cases. "Mrs. Coleman, I've handled similar situations in 3 other Pennsylvania counties over the past 5 years. In each case, we've discovered that predatory landlords like Thornton keep detailed records of their activities because they believe their methods are completely legal." He spread several documents across the desk, their official appearance and formal language suggesting court proceedings that had already reached successful conclusions. "If we can obtain access to Thornton's business records through legal discovery procedures, we'll likely find documentation that proves his systematic approach to exploiting vulnerable families. He probably has files showing his deliberate timing, his inflated damage assessments, and his calculations about which families are most likely to pay unjust settlements." The possibility of using Thornton's own records against him appealed to Margaret's sense of poetic justice, but she understood enough about legal procedures to recognize that obtaining such access might prove difficult and expensive. "How do we gain access to his private business records?" Whitfield asked, voicing the practical question that Margaret had been formulating. Walsh smiled with the satisfaction of someone revealing a well-planned strategy. "We file a comprehensive lawsuit that alleges systematic fraud and demands full discovery of his business practices. Once we establish probable cause for believing that fraud has occurred, the court can compel him to produce all relevant documentation. The approach was elegant in its simplicity, but Margaret recognized that it also involved significant risks. Filing such a comprehensive lawsuit would commit them irrevocably to a major legal battle, eliminating any possibility of quiet settlement or graceful withdrawal if complications arose. "Mr. Walsh," she said carefully, "what happens if we pursue this strategy and lose? What would be the consequences for my family and for other families in the community?" The lawyer's expression grew more serious as he considered the implications of her question. "Mrs. Coleman, I won't minimize the risks involved. If we lose decisively, it could strengthen Thornton's position and make him more aggressive in pursuing similar tactics against other families. You personally could face not just his original damage claims, but additional legal expenses and potentially punitive judgments." He paused to let the weight of these possibilities settle before continuing. "However, based on my review of the evidence and my experience with similar cases, I believe our prospects for success are strong enough to justify the risks. More importantly, the current situation is unsustainable for this community. Thornton's exploitation will continue and escalate unless someone takes a stand against it." The conversation was interrupted by Clara Henderson's voice from the store's main area, where she appeared to be engaged in animated discussion with Emma about some urgent matter. Margaret excused herself to address whatever situation had developed, leaving Walsh and Whitfield to continue their strategic planning. Clara Henderson stood at the main counter with her usual composed demeanor somewhat ruffled by obvious agitation. The neighbor who had been among Margaret's most reliable sources of support during their difficult months rarely displayed such visible emotion, making her current state particularly noteworthy. "Margaret," Clara said as soon as she appeared, "I've just come from town where I encountered Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Kelly. Both families have received legal notices from Marcus Thornton making claims similar to yours. He's apparently decided to pursue multiple families simultaneously." This development added a new dimension to their legal situation that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Rather than being isolated targets, several families were apparently facing Thornton's exploitation concurrently, suggesting that he had adopted an even more aggressive strategy than anyone had realized. "What specific claims is he making against the Patterson and Kelly families?" Margaret asked, her mind already working through the implications of this expanded campaign. Clara consulted notes she had hastily scribbled during her conversations with the affected families. Similar allegations about property damage and unpaid rent, but with amounts that vary depending on each family's apparent ability to pay. Pattersons are facing claims of $200, while the Kellys are being asked for over $400. The variation in demanded amounts confirmed Walsh's analysis about Thornton's calculated approach to exploitation. He was apparently calibrating his claims based on assessments of each family's resources and vulnerability rather than actual damage to properties. Margaret returned to the office with this new information, finding Walsh and Whitfield deep in discussion about discovery procedures and witness preparation. Both men looked up with immediate attention as she explained Clara Henderson's report about additional families facing similar legal threats. "This changes our strategic situation significantly," Walsh observed after hearing the details. "Multiple simultaneous actions suggest that Thornton has decided to accelerate his exploitation campaign, possibly because he suspects that opposition is developing." Whitfield nodded grimly. "It also means that we have potential allies who are facing the same threats. The Patterson and Kelly families might be willing to join a coordinated legal response rather than trying to fight individual battles." The possibility of a coordinated defense appealed to Margaret's sense of community solidarity, but she also recognized that it would multiply both the complexity and the stakes involved in their legal battle. Success would benefit multiple families and potentially protect the entire community from future exploitation. Failure would harm not just the Colemans, but everyone who had joined their fight. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "if we're going to invite other families to join our legal action, we need to be completely honest with them about both the potential benefits and the risks involved. These are people who have already suffered from Thornton's predatory behavior. We can't ask them to take additional risks without ensuring they understand exactly what they're committing to." The lawyer's expression reflected approval of her ethical concerns. "Mrs. Coleman, your commitment to protecting other families while pursuing your own case demonstrates exactly the kind of character that makes plaintiffs credible to judges and juries. If we can document that same kind of integrity in the other affected families, our case becomes much stronger." The afternoon was spent developing detailed plans for approaching the Patterson and Kelly families, along with any others who might have been targeted by Thornton's latest campaign. Walsh would return to Pittsburgh to begin preparing the comprehensive legal filing, while Margaret and Whitfield would coordinate with Pastor Mills and Sheriff Carter to document the broader pattern of exploitation. As evening approached and Walsh prepared to return to the train station, Margaret found herself reflecting on how much their situation had evolved since the morning. What had begun as a defensive action against Thornton's specific claims had transformed into a community-wide response to systematic predatory behavior. "Mrs. Coleman," Walsh said as they prepared his departure, "I want you to understand that what we're undertaking goes beyond typical legal proceedings. If we succeed, we'll be establishing precedents that could protect vulnerable families throughout Pennsylvania from similar exploitation. That's important work, but it also means that we'll be facing opponents who have significant resources and strong motivations to prevent our success." Margaret considered his warning while helping Emma and Samuel with the evening closing procedures. For the store, the work had become routine for all of them, but she noticed that her children seemed to approach their responsibilities with particular care and attention, as if they understood that their family's stability depended on proving their value to Whitfield's business operations. The realization that their legal battle might attract attention and opposition from beyond Millbrook Valley was sobering, but it also confirmed that their fight was addressing problems larger than their own immediate situation. The Coleman family's winter of desperation had prepared them for challenges that most families never faced, giving them both the motivation and the resilience necessary for the battle ahead. That evening, after Walsh's departure and the completion of their daily business responsibilities, Margaret gathered her children in their apartment's main room for the kind of family meeting that had become necessary whenever important decisions needed to be made collectively. "Children," she began, using the serious tone that signaled discussion of matters affecting their entire family, "our legal situation has become more complicated, but also more important than we initially understood. Other families in our community are facing the same kind of exploitation that we're fighting, and we have an opportunity to help protect them." Emma, who had been observing the day's legal discussions with her characteristic attention to detail, spoke first. "Mother, does this mean that our case will take longer and require more resources than we originally planned?" The question reflected exactly the kind of practical thinking that Margaret had come to expect from her eldest daughter. Emma's maturity and business acumen had developed rapidly during their weeks at Whitfield's store, but she retained the protective instincts toward her family that their months of hardship had cultivated. "It means that we're taking on additional responsibilities and risks," Margaret replied honestly, "but also that we have allies who share our commitment to fighting injustice. The Patterson and Kelly families are facing the same threats we are, and working together makes all of us stronger." Samuel, who had been quietly whittling while listening to the conversation, looked up from his work with the thoughtful expression he wore when processing complex information. "Mother, if we're fighting for other families as well as ourselves, does that mean Mr. Thornton will be more determined to defeat us? Will he bring additional resources to bear against our case?" The boy's question demonstrated understanding of strategic thinking that impressed. Margaret, even as it reminded her of how much responsibility her children had been forced to shoulder. During their family's difficulties, Samuel had developed the kind of analytical approach to problems that would serve him well throughout his life, regardless of how their current legal battle resolved. Mr. Thornton will certainly take our challenge more seriously if he realizes that we're threatening his entire system of exploitation, Margaret acknowledged. But that also means that defeating him will provide greater protection for our community and greater satisfaction for our family. Lucy, who had been helping Anna with arithmetic homework while listening to the adult conversation, raised her hand in the gesture she used when seeking permission to contribute to serious discussions. Mother, will fighting this bigger battle mean that we have less time and attention for learning the grain business and building our new life here? The question reflected wisdom beyond Lucy's 12 years, recognizing that their legal battle could consume resources and energy that might otherwise be devoted to consolidating their improved circumstances. Margaret had been wrestling with similar concerns throughout the day's discussions. Lucy, that's an important consideration, she replied. Fighting Mr. Thornton's exploitation will require significant time and attention, but it's also part of building the kind of life and community we want to be part of. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that protect not just ourselves, but our neighbors as well. The conversation continued as each child raised questions and concerns about their family's expanding legal commitments. Margaret was struck by their collective maturity and their instinctive understanding that personal security often depended on community stability. These children had learned lessons about interdependence and mutual support that many adults never mastered. Benjamin, whose storytelling gifts had entertained and comforted his siblings during their darkest months, offered his own perspective on their situation. Mother, this sounds like the stories about knights who have to choose between protecting their own castles and helping defend the whole kingdom. The knights who help everyone usually end up stronger and safer than the ones who only think about themselves. His childish analogy captured something essential about their moral situation that all the legal and strategic discussions had somehow missed. Margaret realized that her son had identified the fundamental choice they were making between narrow self-interest and broader community responsibility. Benjamin, she said, smiling at his insight, that's exactly right. We're choosing to be knights who defend the whole kingdom, even though it means taking bigger risks and fighting harder battles. As the evening progressed and her children prepared for bed, Margaret found herself standing at the apartment window that overlooked Main Street, watching the lights in other homes where families were probably having similar conversations about security, opportunity, and moral obligation. The Coleman family's transformation from desperate refugees to community defenders represented more than just personal recovery. It demonstrated the kind of resilience and solidarity that made communities worth defending. The legal battle ahead would test everything they had learned about courage, determination, and the value of standing up for principle, even when the costs were high. But Margaret felt confident that her family was prepared for whatever challenges Marcus Thornton and his allies might bring against them. The widow's winter had ended not just with survival, but with the opportunity to ensure that other families would not face the same predatory exploitation that had threatened to destroy everything they had worked to rebuild. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but also the satisfaction of knowing that their fight served purposes larger than their own immediate welfare. Victor Sterling arrived in Millbrook Valley on the coldest day of January, stepping off the morning train with the kind of calculated precision that marked men accustomed to wielding authority over others. Unlike the traveling businessmen and territorial officials who occasionally visited the valley, Sterling carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone whose power derived from political connections rather than honest commerce. His expensive overcoat and polished leather boots spoke of resources that far exceeded those available to local residents, while his pale complexion and soft hands suggested a life spent in offices rather than facing the practical challenges of frontier existence. Margaret first became aware of Sterling's presence through Jake Morrison, who had observed the stranger's arrival at the train station and noted his immediate meeting with Marcus Thornton. The warehouse supervisor possessed the kind of practical intelligence that made him valuable to Whitfield's operation, including an instinct for recognizing trouble before it fully materialized. His report to Margaret carried the weight of genuine concern rather than idle gossip. "Mrs. Coleman," Morrison said as he helped organize the morning grain deliveries, "the fellow who met with Thornton at the hotel isn't just another lawyer or business associate. Everything about him screams territorial politics, and men like that don't visit places like Millbrook Valley unless they're planning something that affects more than just local property disputes." Margaret had learned to trust Morrison's assessments of character and situation, his years of experience with various types of people having given him reliable instincts about human nature and political maneuvering. If he felt concerned about Sterling's presence, there were probably substantial reasons for that concern. "What specifically did you observe that suggests political connections?" Margaret asked, pausing in her review of inventory records to give Morrison her full attention. Morrison removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through his graying hair, the gesture he used when organizing complex thoughts for clear presentation. The way he carried himself, the deference that even Thornton showed him, the fact that Sheriff Carter seemed uncomfortable during their brief conversation on Main Street. Plus, his clothing and equipment suggest someone with access to resources that go well beyond what local legal disputes would justify. The implications of Morrison's observations were troubling, but not entirely surprising. Franklin Walsh had warned them that their legal challenge to Thornton's predatory practices might attract attention from interests that extended beyond Millbrook Valley, particularly if their success threatened similar operations in other communities. Margaret spent the remainder of the morning discreetly gathering information about Sterling's activities and the purpose of his visit. Emma, whose natural social intelligence had made her popular with customers, proved particularly valuable in collecting details about conversations that had taken place at the hotel and in various businesses along Main Street. "Mother," Emma reported during their midday break, "Sterling has been asking questions about our family situation and Mr. Whitfield's business operations. According to Mrs. Patterson, he seemed particularly interested in understanding how we've managed to organize legal opposition to Mr. Thornton's claims." This confirmation that Sterling's interest focused on their legal challenge rather than general Valley affairs suggested that their case had indeed attracted the kind of high-level attention that Walsh had warned them to expect. Margaret felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at the realization that their fight against local exploitation had apparently achieved sufficient prominence to merit intervention by territorial political figures. The afternoon brought more concrete evidence of Sterling's intentions when he appeared at Whitfield's store, accompanied by two men whose bearing suggested professional authority of some kind. Margaret observed their approach through the office window, noting immediately that Sterling's companions wore badges that identified them as territorial tax assessors. Henry Whitfield emerged from his warehouse inspection to greet the visitors with the kind of polite caution that successful businessmen learn to employ when dealing with unexpected official attention. Margaret positioned herself where she could observe the interaction while remaining available to assist with any business needs that might arise. "Mr. Whitfield," Sterling said without preamble, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to immediate deference, "I represent certain territorial interests that have concerns about recent developments in Millbrook Valley. These gentlemen are here to conduct a comprehensive review of your business operations and tax compliance." The phrasing of Sterling's introduction was carefully neutral, but Margaret recognized the implicit threat contained in his words. Tax investigations could be used as weapons against businesses whose owners had attracted political displeasure, particularly when those investigations were conducted by assessors who understood their role in advancing particular agendas. Whitfield responded with the kind of dignified cooperation that demonstrated both respect for legitimate authority and refusal to be intimidated by political pressure. "Gentlemen, my books and records are completely available for your review. Mrs. Coleman manages our daily operations and can provide whatever documentation you require." The mention of Margaret's role in the business operations drew Sterling's immediate attention, his pale eyes focusing on her with the kind of calculating assessment that suggested he had been specifically briefed about her situation and activities. "Mrs. Coleman," Sterling said, approaching her position behind the main counter with deliberate steps, "I understand that you've been quite active in organizing local opposition to legitimate business activities. That kind of community agitation sometimes reflects misunderstanding of proper legal and commercial procedures." The veiled threat in his words was unmistakable, but Margaret had faced more direct intimidation during her months of poverty and desperation. Sterling's polished menace seemed almost genteel compared to the raw desperation she had confronted when her family faced actual starvation. "Mr. Sterling," she replied with the kind of respectful firmness that acknowledged authority while refusing to accept intimidation, "I've been defending my family against false legal claims and helping other families understand their rights in similar situations. If that constitutes community agitation, then I suppose I'm guilty as charged." Her response clearly surprised Sterling, whose experience had probably taught him to expect deference or defensiveness from people in her position. The slight narrowing of his eyes suggested that he was reassessing both her character and the difficulty of the task he had undertaken. The tax assessors spent the next 3 hours conducting what appeared to be a legitimate review of Whitfield's business records, though Margaret noticed that their questions often strayed into areas that seemed more concerned with political activities than tax compliance. They showed particular interest in the store's relationships with farming families who had been targeted by Thornton's exploitation, suggesting that Sterling's investigation encompassed the entire network of families involved in their legal resistance. Samuel, who had been working in the warehouse when the officials arrived, appeared in the main store area with news that added another dimension to the day's developments. The boy's expression carried the kind of serious concern that Margaret had learned to associate with genuinely important information. "Mother," he said quietly, positioning himself where their conversation couldn't be overheard by Sterling or his associates, "Jake Morrison asked me to tell you that similar groups of officials have been visiting the Patterson and Kelly families. Today, all 3 visits happened simultaneously, suggesting coordinated action rather than routine inspections. This confirmation that their legal allies were facing similar pressure indicated that Sterling's intervention represented a systematic response to their community, organizing rather than isolated harassment of individual families. The realization that they had apparently succeeded in threatening interests powerful enough to mobilize territorial political resources was both gratifying and intimidating. Margaret excused herself from monitoring the tax assessment to check on Emma, who had been handling customer service duties while the main store area was occupied by official business. She found her daughter dealing with several farming families who had obviously come to town specifically to show support for Whitfield's store during its period of official scrutiny. "Mrs. Coleman," said Robert Henderson, Clara's husband, as he completed a significant purchase of seed grain, "Word's gotten around about the pressure your family and the store are facing. Folks wanted to make sure you knew that the community stands behind you in this fight." The demonstration of support was deeply moving, but Margaret also recognized that it might create additional complications if Sterling interpreted community solidarity as evidence of the kind of organized resistance that territorial authorities typically sought to suppress. The line between legitimate community support and dangerous political organizing was often thinner than people realized. "Mr. Henderson," she replied carefully, "we appreciate the community's confidence, but I want to ensure that supporting our family doesn't create difficulties for other people. This situation may become more complicated than anyone initially expected. Her warning proved prescient when Sterling concluded his business with the tax assessors and approached her with the kind of formal demeanor that usually preceded official pronouncements. His pale face wore an expression of calculated satisfaction that suggested he had discovered something significant during his investigation. "Mrs. Coleman," Sterling said, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone delivering carefully prepared statements. "The preliminary results of today's review have identified several irregularities in this business's operations that require immediate attention. These irregularities suggest violations of territorial commercial regulations that carry substantial penalties. The accusation was obviously fabricated, designed to create leverage that could be used to pressure both Margaret and Whitfield into abandoning their legal challenge to Thornton's exploitation." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest at the transparent attempt to use official authority to protect predatory behavior. "Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice remaining level despite the emotion she felt, "I'm curious about the specific nature of these alleged irregularities. Mr. Whitfield's business operations have been exemplary in every respect, and I'm confident that any thorough review will confirm that assessment." Sterling's smile carried no warmth as he prepared to deliver what was obviously intended as a decisive blow to their resistance. The irregularities involve improper documentation of employee relationships, questions about the legitimacy of certain business partnerships, and concerns about the mixing of commercial activities with political organizing. Each accusation was carefully crafted to exploit potential vulnerabilities in their situation. Margaret's employment arrangement with Whitfield, while entirely legitimate, involved unconventional aspects that could be misrepresented by hostile investigators. Their legal organizing, though completely legal, could be characterized as inappropriate political activity if viewed through a sufficiently prejudiced lens. Whitfield, who had been observing this exchange while maintaining his usual composed demeanor, stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that had made him successful in business dealings throughout his career. His presence seemed to fill the space around Sterling's smaller frame without any obvious display of aggression or intimidation. "Mr. Sterling," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and moral certainty, "if you have specific charges to make against my business operations, I suggest you proceed through proper legal channels rather than attempting to intimidate my employees with vague accusations. Mrs. Coleman and her family are valued members of this community, and they have every right to defend themselves against fraudulent legal claims." The grain merchant's direct challenge clearly surprised Sterling, whose political experience had probably taught him to expect business owners to prioritize their commercial interests over principle when faced with official pressure. Whitfield's willingness to defend Margaret's family despite potential consequences for his own business represented exactly the kind of community solidarity that territorial authorities found most threatening. Sterling's response revealed both his determination and his recognition that simple intimidation would not suffice to suppress the resistance he had been sent to eliminate. "Mr. Whitfield, your loyalty to Mrs. Coleman is admirable but misguided. The irregularities we've identified extend beyond simple documentation issues. They suggest patterns of activity that could be interpreted as conspiracy to defraud territorial authorities. The escalation to charges of conspiracy represented a significant increase in the stakes involved in their conflict. Conspiracy allegations carried penalties that could destroy both Whitfield's business and Margaret's family security, while also discrediting their legal challenge to Thornton's predatory practices. Margaret realized that they had reached a crucial decision point, where continued resistance would require accepting risks that extended far beyond their original legal dispute. Yet the alternative of surrendering to Sterling's pressure would not only abandon other families to Thornton's exploitation, but would also validate the use of political intimidation to suppress legitimate legal challenges. "Mr. Sterling," she sighed, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had sustained her family through their months of poverty and hardship. "I'm not certain what authority you believe gives you the right to make such threats against honest people defending themselves against fraud, but I can assure you that we won't be intimidated into abandoning our legal rights." Her defiant response produced an immediate change in Sterling's demeanor, his practiced political composure giving way to obvious anger at being challenged by someone he had expected to find vulnerable to pressure. The mask of civilized authority slipped enough to reveal the calculating ruthlessness that lay beneath his polished exterior. "Mrs. Coleman, you seem to misunderstand the gravity of your situation. The territorial government has substantial resources for dealing with individuals who organize resistance to legitimate business activities. Your continued defiance will only ensure that those resources are brought to bear against your family and your allies." The threat was now explicit rather than veiled, confirming that their legal challenge had indeed attracted the attention of political interests with the power to make life extremely difficult for anyone who opposed them. Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had accompanied every major crisis her family had faced, but also the steady resolve that had carried them through each challenge. Emma, who had been observing the confrontation while maintaining her customer service duties, appeared at Margaret's side with the kind of quiet support that had sustained their family through every difficulty. The girl's presence reminded Margaret that their fight involved not just abstract principles, but the concrete welfare of children who depended on adult courage and wisdom. "Mother," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying calm determination that reflected her growing maturity, "whatever Mr. Sterling is threatening, we've faced worse and survived. Our family doesn't abandon fights when they become difficult." The simple statement of family solidarity seemed to deflate some of Sterling's confidence in his ability to achieve his objectives through intimidation alone. His pale eyes moved between Margaret and Emma with obvious reassessment of both their vulnerability and their determination. Samuel appeared from the warehouse area where he had been working, his arrival coinciding with that of Pastor Mills and Sheriff Carter, both of whom entered the store with expressions that suggested they were responding to reports about the day's official activities. The gathering of community leaders around Margaret and her family clearly frustrated Sterling's attempt to isolate and pressure his targets. "Mrs. Coleman," Pastor Mills said, his voice carrying the moral authority that had made him a respected figure throughout Millbrook Valley, "I understand there have been questions raised about the legitimacy of your family's activities. I want you to know that the community stands ready to support you in whatever ways prove necessary." Sheriff Carter nodded his agreement with the pastor's statement. "Mrs. Coleman, if there are allegations of wrongdoing, they should be addressed through proper legal channels rather than through intimidation and unofficial pressure. My office is prepared to ensure that all parties receive fair treatment under territorial law." The demonstration of community support clearly exceeded Sterling's expectations for local response to his intervention. His mission had apparently been predicated on the assumption that isolated families could be pressured into submission without significant community resistance. "Gentlemen," Sterling said, his voice tight with controlled frustration, "you seem to misunderstand the scope of the issues involved here. This situation extends beyond local property disputes to questions of territorial authority and commercial regulation. Community loyalty, while admirable, cannot override legitimate governmental concerns." Pastor Mills responded with the kind of gentle firmness that had made him effective in dealing with various types of conflict throughout his ministry. "Mr. Sterling, we understand that governmental authority must be respected, but we also believe that authority derives its legitimacy from serving justice rather than protecting exploitation. Mrs. Coleman's family has committed no crimes beyond defending themselves against fraudulent claims." The pastor's words articulated principles that resonated throughout the small group that had gathered in support of Margaret's family. The confrontation had crystallized around fundamental questions about the proper relationship between governmental authority, and community welfare. Sterling recognized that his mission had become significantly more complicated than his superiors had anticipated. Rather than facing isolated families vulnerable to pressure, he had encountered organized community resistance based on clearly articulated moral principles. The situation required different tactics than simple intimidation. "Very well," he said. Finally, his voice carrying the kind of controlled menace that suggested strategic withdrawal rather than defeat. "I can see that this community has chosen to align itself with individuals who place personal interest above respect for legitimate authority. That alignment will be noted in my reports to territorial officials." The implicit threat in his words was clear to everyone present. Sterling was promising that Millbrook Valley's support for Margaret's family would result in broader governmental pressure against the entire community. The stakes in their conflict were expanding beyond individual legal disputes to encompass fundamental questions about community autonomy and resistance to political intimidation. As Sterling and his associates departed, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension mixed with defiant solidarity, Margaret found herself reflecting on how completely their situation had transformed since Henry Whitfield's first visit to their cabin. What had begun as desperate acceptance of employment had evolved into community leadership in a struggle that might determine whether ordinary families could defend themselves against predatory exploitation protected by political authority. The widow's winter had ended with more than survival and recovery. It had produced the kind of moral clarity and community solidarity that could challenge power structures that most people accepted as unchangeable. Tomorrow would bring new pressures and new challenges, but also new opportunities to demonstrate that courage and principle could prevail, even against seemingly overwhelming opposition. The spring thaw of 1888 brought more than melting snow to Millbrook Valley. It carried word that Franklin Walsh's comprehensive legal strategy had achieved results that exceeded everyone's expectations, including the discovery of documents in Marcus Thornton's files that revealed connections to a network of predatory landlords operating throughout 3 Pennsylvania counties. Victor Sterling's investigation had backfired spectacularly when territorial authorities discovered that his own activities constituted abuse of governmental power for personal enrichment. Margaret stood in the main area of Whitfield's store, now expanded to occupy the adjacent building as well, watching Emma direct a crew of workers who were installing new shelving systems designed to accommodate their growing inventory. The past 18 months had transformed not just the Coleman family's circumstances, but the entire character of their business operations. What had begun as a simple grain and feed store had evolved into the valley's primary distribution center for agricultural supplies, with Margaret serving as general manager of an enterprise that employed 12 people and served farming communities across 4 counties. The legal victory had created ripple effects throughout Pennsylvania's territorial administration. Sterling faced criminal charges for conspiracy and abuse of authority, while Thornton had fled the territory rather than face prosecution for systematic fraud. More importantly, their success had established legal precedents that protected vulnerable families throughout the region from similar exploitation. Walsh had used their case to build a broader practice defending rural communities against predatory business practices, with the Coleman family story serving as inspiration for resistance efforts across the frontier. Samuel emerged from the expanded warehouse area where he had been training 2 new employees in proper grain handling procedures. At 16, he had grown into the kind of reliable foreman that successful operations required, combining his natural mechanical aptitude with leadership, skills that had developed through necessity during their family's difficult period. His transformation from desperate boy trying to fill his father's shoes into confident young man building his own future represented everything positive about their journey from poverty to prosperity. "Mother," he said, approaching Margaret's position behind the main counter, "the railroad delivery schedules have been confirmed for the next 3 months. We're looking at a 40% increase in volume compared to last year, which means we'll need to hire additional warehouse staff by summer. The business growth that Samuel's report represented would have been unimaginable during their desperate winter in the cabin. Margaret sometimes struggled to reconcile their current prosperity with memories of rationing food and wondering whether they would survive until spring. The contrast served as a constant reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when people had opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. Lucy appeared from the office area where she had been working on correspondence with suppliers and customers throughout the region. At 14, she had developed business communication skills that rivaled those of experienced clerks. Her natural warmth and intelligence, making her particularly effective at building relationships that sustained long-term commercial success. The girl's letters had become so highly regarded that other businesses had begun requesting her assistance with their own customer relations. "Mother," Lucy reported, "we've received 3 more inquiries from communities asking Mr. Whitfield to consider opening branch operations in their areas. The success of our model here has apparently attracted attention from places facing similar challenges with predatory business practices." The expansion opportunities that Lucy described represented validation of everything they had worked to achieve during their transformation from desperate family to successful business operation. Yet Margaret found herself cautious about growth that might compromise the community focus that had made their success meaningful rather than merely profitable. Henry Whitfield entered from his inspection of the new storage facilities, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose business vision had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. The grain merchant had evolved during their partnership from successful individual entrepreneur to leader of what was becoming a regional commercial network, based on principles of fair dealing and community service. "Margaret," he said, settling into the chair he had installed near the main counter for their daily planning discussions, "I've been thinking about those expansion inquiries Lucy mentioned. We have an opportunity to replicate our success in other communities, but only if we can maintain the values and relationships that made success possible here." His observation touched on concerns that had been occupying Margaret's thoughts. As their business continued to grow and attract attention from outside interests, success brought opportunities but also challenges, particularly the challenge of preserving the community connections that had made their triumph over Thornton and Sterling meaningful rather than merely profitable. "Mr. Whitfield," she replied, using the formal address they had maintained despite their evolved partnership, "I think expansion makes sense only if we can ensure that new operations serve community needs rather than simply pursuing commercial opportunities. Our success here came from understanding and responding to real problems that families were facing." Emma joined their discussion, carrying ledger books that documented the financial performance that had made expansion possible. Her business acumen had developed to the point where other merchants sought her advice about inventory management and customer relations, recognition that reflected both natural intelligence and practical experience gained through necessity. "The numbers support careful expansion," Emma reported, "but only if we maintain our commitment to employee partnerships and community service. Our profit margins here depend on people who are invested in long-term success rather than just collecting wages." The employee partnership model that Emma referenced had evolved naturally from their family's original arrangement with Whitfield. Workers at the store shared not just wages, but also decision-making authority and profit distributions, creating the kind of collective investment that made everyone more effective and more committed to sustainable success. Anna and Benjamin, now 12 and 14 respectively, had found their own roles in the expanding operation. Anna's talent for organization had made her invaluable in maintaining customer records and tracking complex delivery schedules, while Benjamin's storytelling gifts had evolved into a remarkable ability to explain complex agricultural concepts to customers who needed technical information presented in accessible ways. Daniel, at 10, had developed mechanical skills that complemented Samuel's leadership in the warehouse operations, while 8-year-old Grace had become the store's unofficial greeter. Her natural charm and friendliness creating positive first impressions that often determined whether customers became long-term relationships. Pastor Mills arrived as their family business meeting was concluding, his presence now a welcome, rather than worrisome development. The elderly clergyman had become not just spiritual advisor, but practical counselor whose wisdom helped guide decisions that affected the entire community's welfare. "Margaret," Pastor Mills said, accepting Whitfield's offer of coffee and a chair, "I've brought news from Pittsburgh that I thought you should hear immediately. Franklin Walsh has been appointed as a territorial prosecutor with specific responsibility for investigating predatory business practices throughout Pennsylvania." The appointment represented recognition of Walsh's success in their case and validation of the legal strategies that had defeated both Thornton's exploitation and Sterling's political intimidation. More importantly, it meant that the protections they had won for Millbrook Valley would be extended to communities throughout the territory. "That's wonderful news," Margaret replied, "but I suspect it also means that our victory has attracted attention from interests who won't be pleased about Walsh's new authority." Pastor Mills nodded gravely. "Your suspicion is correct. There are powerful people who profited from the kind of exploitation that Walsh is now positioned to investigate and prosecute. They won't accept his appointment without attempting to undermine his effectiveness." The warning reminded Margaret that their triumph had created responsibilities as well as opportunities. As the family whose case had established the legal precedents that Walsh would use in his new position, they would inevitably be targets for retaliation by those who opposed his reforms. Sheriff Carter appeared at the store's entrance, his arrival completing the gathering of community leaders who had supported their fight against Thornton and Sterling. The lawman's presence suggested that Pastor Mills' news involved implications that extended beyond simple legal appointments. "Mrs. Coleman," Sheriff Carter said, removing his hat with the respectful formality he had maintained throughout their acquaintance, "I've received word that certain business interests are organizing opposition to Walsh's appointment. That opposition may include renewed pressure on the communities and families that supported his original cases." The possibility of renewed conflict was sobering but not surprising. Margaret had learned during their legal battle that defeating predatory behavior often provoked escalation rather than acceptance, as those who profited from exploitation sought new ways to protect their interests. "What specific form is this opposition likely to take?" Whitfield asked, his business experience making him naturally concerned about threats to the commercial relationships they had built. Sheriff Carter consulted notes he had brought with him, his expression reflecting the careful preparation he applied to all official matters. Economic pressure on businesses that supported the legal challenges, political pressure on local officials who testified against exploitation, and legal harassment of families who served as witnesses in prosecution cases. The comprehensive nature of the opposition strategy suggested that their victory had indeed threatened interests powerful enough to mount sophisticated retaliation campaigns. Yet Margaret felt less intimidated by these prospects than she might have expected, her confidence bolstered by the strength of the community relationships they had developed. "Sheriff," she said, "our family and our business have survived worse threats than economic and political pressure. What concerns me more is ensuring that other families don't suffer because they supported our fight for justice." Her response reflected the evolution in her thinking from individual survival to community leadership, a transformation that had occurred gradually as their circumstances improved and their influence expanded. The pregnant widow who had faced starvation 2 years earlier had become a community advocate whose decisions affected dozens of families. Emma, who had been listening to the adult conversation while continuing to manage business operations, stepped forward with the kind of practical insight that characterized her approach to complex problems. "Mother," she said, If we're facing organized opposition from powerful interests, shouldn't we be organizing our own coordinated response? The communities that Walsh will be protecting have common interests in maintaining the legal protections we helped establish. The suggestion revealed strategic thinking that impressed even the experienced adults present. Emma had identified the fundamental challenge they faced. Countering organized opposition required organized resistance based on shared principles and mutual support. Whitfield leaned forward with the animated expression that indicated developing business strategy. Emma makes an excellent point. We have relationships with dozens of communities that have benefited from Walsh's legal precedents. Those communities have strong motivations to protect the reforms that serve their interests. Pastor Mills nodded approvingly. What you're describing sounds like the kind of coordinated community action that has always been necessary when ordinary people face powerful opposition. The question is whether we're prepared to undertake the responsibility that such coordination would require. The conversation continued throughout the afternoon as they developed plans for responding to the opposition that Walsh's appointment would inevitably provoke. By evening, they had outlined a comprehensive strategy for maintaining communication with allied communities, coordinating responses to economic and political pressure, and ensuring that legal protections remained effective despite attempts to undermine them. As spring progressed towards summer, their preparations proved prescient. Economic pressure materialized in the form of suppliers who suddenly raised prices for businesses that had supported the anti-exploitation cases. Political pressure emerged through territorial officials who began questioning local autonomy in communities that had resisted predatory practices. Legal harassment manifested in frivolous lawsuits designed to exhaust resources and discourage continued resistance. Yet the opposition strategy failed to achieve its objectives, largely because the communities it targeted had learned to function as a coordinated network rather than isolated targets. When suppliers raised prices for one business, alternative sources were quickly identified through allied communities. When political officials applied pressure in one area, resistance was reinforced by support from neighboring regions. When legal harassment threatened individual families, collective resources ensured effective defense. Margaret found herself serving as a central coordinator for this network of resistance. Her transformation from desperate widow to community leader, complete in ways that sometimes surprised even her. The skills she had developed managing Whitfield's business operations translated naturally into organizing community responses to complex challenges that required both practical competence and moral clarity. The climax of their struggle came when territorial authorities attempted to revoke Walsh's appointment through political maneuvering designed to eliminate the legal protections their victory had established. The attempt failed when coordinated. Resistance from dozens of communities demonstrated that the reforms enjoyed support too widespread to be suppressed through political manipulation. By autumn of 1888, their network of allied communities had evolved into a permanent organization dedicated to protecting rural families from exploitation and ensuring that legal protections remained effective despite changing political circumstances. Margaret's role had expanded from business manager to regional coordinator for an organization that served thousands of families across Pennsylvania. The transformation was complete when Walsh approached her about serving as assistant territorial prosecutor with specific responsibility for community liaison and victim advocacy. The position would formalize her role in protecting families from exploitation, while providing resources necessary for expanding their protective network to other territories. Standing once again at the window of the apartment above Whitfield's store, Margaret watched the lights in homes throughout Millbrook Valley while considering the opportunities and responsibilities that Walsh's offer represented. The woman who had once rationed food for her children while wondering if they would survive winter now faced decisions that would affect the welfare of families throughout Pennsylvania. Emma joined her at the window, the girl's presence providing the kind of supportive companionship that had sustained them through every challenge their family had faced. Together they watched the evening activities of a community that had been transformed by their courage to resist exploitation and their commitment to protecting others from similar predatory behavior. "Mother," Emma said quietly, "whatever you decide about Mr. Walsh's offer, I want you to know that our family will support you completely. We've learned that the most important battles are the ones fought not just for ourselves, but for people who can't fight for themselves." The wisdom in her daughter's words reflected everything positive about their journey from desperate poverty to meaningful prosperity. They had discovered that true security came not from avoiding conflict, but from building communities strong enough to protect their most vulnerable members. Margaret accepted Walsh's appointment, and her work as territorial advocate became the foundation for legal protections that eventually extended throughout the American frontier. The pregnant widow's story of survival became a legend of community transformation, proving that courage and determination could create changes that outlasted individual lifetimes. The Coleman family's success became a model replicated in communities across the developing nation, demonstrating that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to stand together against exploitation and injustice. Their winter of desperation had produced a spring of hope that bloomed into lasting change for thousands of families who never knew their names but benefited from their courage. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.